with you this morning, and hopefully this will be of interest for you in terms of what Hydro-Québec is doing these days in strategic planning. So just to give you a little bit of background, we set up a new vice presidency for acquisitions, business development, and strategy at the beginning of 2016. And I joined that group when it was started. We have under us the strategic planning function for all of the company. So today what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of an idea of how we established our strategic plan, so how it was put together right from the beginning, from a government decree until publication, and then we'll go through some of the major priorities, the major orientations of the strategic plan. So in terms of the making of this plan, first of all, why do we do it? This is basically to give us a vision for the company on the short, near, and long term. It's a good tool that we use both internally for our employees and externally for our clients, be they in Quebec or elsewhere, to really explain what the company's objectives are in the coming years, what is our commitment to our customers, and to kind of give us a way of determining whether or not we're meeting the commitments that we're establishing for ourselves. A little bit complicated here, so I'm going to go quickly through. This is a very summarized look at how we established this. Back in the spring of 2015, the Quebec government actually has to give us an order in council that establishes the guidelines for what our strategic plan should look like. Now, going back in time, those orders in council are sometimes very short. This basically tells us that we need to do a strategic plan for the coming 5 years. Sometimes they're more detailed, depending on where the government policy is. We then look at what our CEO wants to have in his strategic plan. We have a new CEO since July of 2015, so Eric Martel has given quite a different spin on some of our activities, and we'll see those as we go through the presentation. The Quebec government also put out an energy policy through to 2030. So, of course, being a state-owned company, that is a very essential part of the determination of our short and near-term goals. And then as we're going through, once the strategic plan was established, we have to go back through a parliamentary committee to explain to our elected officials what is in the strategic plan, why it was established that way, and why we have established our priorities in that way. Final point here is in terms of our management system. So we have a strategic plan that is not just a document that we set out once every few years and then don't think about for the next years. It actually becomes the basis of what our management, from senior management all the way down, has to put into their annual objectives. So these objectives are what actually give them their bonus at the end of the year. So it's a very integrated system, which basically reminds everybody on a yearly basis, and I'm sure everybody is thinking that they would like their bonus at the end of the year, so it's not often something that is forgotten by employees in the company. So they're thinking about these general company objectives on a fairly regular basis. The Quebec Government Order in Council that I spoke about will define the structure, the content, and the frequency of the plan. So in this case, the plan was established for the period of 2016-2020. This will tell us when the plan has to be filed with the minister, how it will be reviewed by the Parliamentary Committee, and in the case of this most recent order in council, it gave us actually quite a bit of detail as to what the government was looking for in terms of content, in terms of some very specific objectives on growth outside Quebec, energy efficiency, and electric transportation. Of course, we then go to our CEO, who gave us some general objectives that he wanted. So one of these was that he wanted to create, again, inside of Quebec, a feeling of pride in the company. If you look back in Hydro-Quebec's history, the company was very closely linked to a lot of economic development throughout the 70s and the 80s. If you speak to people in Quebec, everyone has an uncle or an aunt or sometimes a grandfather who worked on one of the big Hydro-Quebec infrastructure projects. So going back to that time, there was a major source of pride. We've lost it a little bit over the years for a whole lot of reasons, and one of the CEO's objectives is to bring that sense of pride back. He wanted this to be a good communications tool for us. So not to be a very dry document, but rather something that the public could easily understand, could read through very quickly, and really get a sense of what Hydro-Quebec was trying to do. In terms of the tone, it's quite different from our previous strategic plans, which were very maybe not written in a first-person sense. So we rarely would use the word we in our strategic plans in the past. It was always Hydro-Quebec this, Hydro-Quebec has the objective of. So the way that it's written now is quite different. We do find we would like to do this, we have a vision to build the company in this way. So it's a much closer terms of writing to people. A very centralized corporate vision. So regardless of the fact that our company is divided into divisions along the generation, transmission, distribution side, this strategic plan does not speak of divisions and separations between those divisions. It's a very centralized and unified corporate vision. It's very simple. It's very visual, and we can send you the link to the strategic plan. It's actually quite easy to find on our website. Very graphic, so less text and maybe more visual cues so that it's easier to understand. The Quebec energy policy. Interesting reading when you know our strategic plan, because we find many elements here that come into our strategic plan. So Hydro-Quebec will continue to be a driving force in Quebec's economic development. The energy policy speaks of acquisition and development of energy infrastructure outside Quebec. So that's one that I'm very interested and involved in. Increasing electricity exports, that's another one of my big ones, and decarbonization of transport. So here in Quebec, because of the way that we produce the vast majority of our electricity, there's not a great deal more that we can do to limit carbon emissions in the electricity sector. However, transportation, so both individual transportation and trucking, things like that, represents about 40% of our CO2 emissions. So that's something that we feel that we can get more involved in as time goes forward. The Parliamentary Committee will look at the plan. So this is the government as well as opposition parties that send representatives to a committee to hear our CEO's presentation and basically to have an entire day of discussion on the strategic plan. Lots of questions, a few challenges to the CEO, but in general an interesting exercise, and I think it really made the parliamentarians understand what we were trying to do. I spoke a little bit about the management system. I won't go into this in great detail, but if you look basically at the top of this graph towards the bottom, you will see that there's a series of steps that bring the strategic plan objectives down into each manager's personal objectives, so individual performance objectives for a year. that are reviewed internally and that do give what we call a bonus at the end of the year. So a very integrated system that ensures that we're basically doing what we had promised to do in the beginning. And it even goes further than that, because managers will be able to cascade, what we call cascading our objectives down. So, for example, my bosses here in business development establish their objectives at the beginning of the year. As a professional here at Hydro-Québec, I have to establish my own objectives, and those objectives must reflect the ones that my managers have. So we're always looking back to that strategic plan and for guidance, basically, in what we should be doing. So let's take a look, getting away from the making of this plan and maybe moving a little bit more towards what is actually put out in the plan. So a little bit more content here. First of all, we, as I'm sure many of you have made this conclusion in your own markets, we look at our internal growth in terms of electricity demand, and for many reasons, reduction in industrial demand, certain industries that have really kind of left the province, pulp and paper perhaps being the first. What we see in our projections over a long period of time is that our growth rate is going to be very low. So we need to be able to grow in some way if we're going to continue to furnish an interesting dividend to our stakeholder, the Quebec government. Basically, the only way that we can do that is to start to look at different cash streams. And by different cash streams, I mean ones that come from outside of Quebec. So here on this graph, you see the current situation, 2015. We see a very flat increase up until 2030. And this is something that, as a company, and as a company who pays a dividend to the government, we can't allow. So we have to find a way to change that very flat curve. Another thing that we have noticed in past years, and this is going back about 5 years in terms of public polls, is that both outside the company and inside the company, there's been maybe a loss of trust, a loss of satisfaction on the part of both our customers and our employees. So many customers will have comments to us that they don't feel that we are focusing enough on their needs, on their primary concerns, that we need to improve the way that we deal with customer services. Through the media, there's a certain lack of understanding as to why we do certain things. The industry in general, I would say, it's not very well known with the media. And I'm speaking as a former media spokesperson here at Hydro-Québec for about 6 years. So I can fairly confidently say that that is the case here. And even within our workforce here at Hydro-Québec, people that were very committed to the company, who believed in what we were doing, who understood the issues that we faced, are having a hard time because they still have this image of the company, yet they have a different image that is being sent to them, notably by media. So we've lost some points on both of those fronts, so both public satisfaction and employee engagement. Some good news, though, we do maintain the lowest residential rates in North America. So from 1 year to the next, this is a comparison in electricity rates that we go through for a number of different cities in North America that has pretty much consistently given us very good results. So we will either be the lowest rate in North America or sometimes the second lowest. Our friends in Manitoba, who also produce majoritarily with hydropower, sometimes beat us out. But this most recent study that is from 2015, we were still the lowest, considerably lowest than some of our close neighbors. So if you look at the other end of this graph, New York and Boston, much higher electricity rates. We want to be able to conserve this advantage of our rates. So one of the big things that we are implementing now is more energy efficiency measures here in Quebec, and within the company we're looking much more at reducing our operating costs. The other major element here is that we have made a commitment to the public that we will be maintaining our rates at or around inflation for the coming years. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. That's one of the major elements that is linked to this growth rate that's very low that I was talking about. Another good thing is that we produce about 7 or 8% of our energy from water. So very little in terms of fossil fuels on our system. The only ones that we have are for communities that are very far from the electricity grid and from an economic perspective could not be connected to the grid. And these tend to be small communities in the far north or in the far east of Quebec. So we have an asset that produces clean, renewable, and very reliable energy. We have a mix of, for those hydro people out there, run-of-the-river and reservoir on our system. So we're able to meet both baseline and peak demand very easily. And not only for Quebec, but we do that for a good portion of the northeast of North America as well through our interconnections and our exports. I guess the other thing that we are fairly well known for is not only our expertise on the hydropower generation side, but also on the transmission side. Because our resources, our biggest resource center is the La Grande complex, which is in northern Quebec. It's about 1,000 kilometers from where I'm sitting today in Montreal, which is the biggest load center. So to be able to operate those facilities and to bring that energy south, and not only to Montreal, but into our export markets as well, we've had to develop a very extensive and a very robust transmission system that is based on the 735 kV line. So we have the most extensive electricity network in North America, operating at very high levels of voltage, and really with very little maneuvering room to have problems. Because of course, I'm looking outside now, it's snowy in Quebec. It's not very cold yet, but that will come in the coming months. And about 75% of Quebecers heat their homes with electricity. So we can't afford to have major outages or problems in winter. This would be a major difficulty for most of our customers. We have enough energy to power Quebec in coming years. Looking at our demand forecasts and looking at the energy that we're still bringing onto the system, we're still in a construction phase. We're finishing up a 1,550 megawatt complex on the Romaine River, where we still have 2 generating stations that will be brought into service between now and 2020. Our major challenge at this point is not on the energy side, it's on the capacity side. So during our winter peak, typically in January or February, when it's been very cold here in Quebec for a few days and people are turning up the heat, they're using more electricity for various things, that's when we hit our demand peak. And this is when we have to have all of our generation and transmission assets working full time. So anything that we can shave off that winter peak through various measures is really something that we put a lot of energy into. Demand-side programs, for example, for our customers are very important. Anything that we can use in terms of a smart grid to displace load throughout the day is very important. I spoke a little bit about sales. This gives you another way of looking at how our sales have been going in previous years. So not a huge increase, and nothing that we can really see at the horizon. We started a number of different programs to look at bringing energy-intensive industry into Quebec, and one of the major focuses of that recently has been data centers. So we have a cold climate. I don't think that's news to anybody. In a data center, basically you're using a lot of electricity for your machines, but you're using even more electricity for your air conditioning to maintain correct temperatures so that those machines can work properly. So this is just a natural competitive advantage that we have, that through the winter months, because of the temperature here, we can afford to use a little bit less energy to cool those buildings. So we have been working very hard to bring some of those data centers here. We're starting to get results. Amazon has announced that they will be locating some of their servers here in Quebec. We are still a very big economic partner here in Quebec, probably the biggest in terms of what is paid into the government. So 3.5 billion Canadian dollars in payments to the Quebec government, and pretty much the same figure for capital investment here in Quebec. So a very big driver of the economy, and a driver of the economy that is located in almost all of the regions. So we are headquartered in Montreal, but we have operations throughout Quebec, both on the generation, transmission, and the distribution side. We have a lot of administrative buildings. In some regions, we are one of the big employers. Looking at our objectives. The first, I like to say that sometimes it's the one that keeps me up late at night. It's to double our revenue in the next 15 years. I'll come back to that in a minute. Second is to really increase our level of customer service. We want to be one of the benchmarks in that, both here in Quebec and elsewhere. To continue to contribute to Quebec's economic development and to its energy transition, so moving away from fossil fuels in the transport sector towards more electrification of transportation, and then to keep our rate increases, as I said before, lower than or equal to inflation. So to get to those objectives, we have 4 major strategies, and I'll go through those quickly. The first is in terms of customer service. So we're looking to improve that. We've already managed to make a certain amount of improvement. What we realized is that our customers were waiting for a long time on the telephone for responses to their questions, for service requests. We were working very much on kind of 9 to 5, 9 o'clock in the morning to 5 in the afternoon system. So we have increased a great deal the offer on weekends and in evenings, and especially in one period of time in Quebec when almost all apartment leases come up for renewal. So there's a lot of moving during that period. We have a lot of extra resources. So not only has the average response time gone down, but we have pure complaints, and we have managed to meet more of our deadlines for connections of new customers. So looking good. We still have quite a bit of activity to do on that side. One of the other things that we've put in is more mobile applications for some of our services, the big one being for power outages here in Quebec. So this has got about 150,000 downloads since it came into existence in the summer, and has really kind of modernized the way that we handle those outages. We have smart grid technology. We have finished pretty much the deployment of smart meters on our system, and that data has really allowed us to be able to pinpoint much more accurately outages and to be able to intervene faster to get people back with their power. Productivity is something that we're looking at as well. So the bottom line there, the green one, is the number of employees that we have in the company. We actually have the lowest number that we have had since 1986. We have many more customers, of course, than we did in 1986. We went from 2.8 million to 4.2, and our assets have more than doubled. So I guess we're doing something right on the productivity side because the numbers seem to add up. We will be looking to some key areas where we can increase efficiency. One, in terms of energy purchases. So really making sure that we're buying the energy that we need to keep up with demand here in Quebec. Implementing more information technologies, bettering our procurement practices. So a big company with lots of divisions where we had kind of differing procurement policies, sometimes from one division to the next. So there has been a major move to harmonize those policies, those practices, and to start getting some economy of scale involved. And once more, employee engagement that we spoke about a little while ago. New growth avenues is really the way that we are looking at how we will be able in the coming 15 years to increase our growth and to increase our revenue in the company. So the first one that we look at is acquisitions or investment, partial investment in hydroelectric generation or high voltage transmission assets outside of Quebec. We have begun to look at a number of different opportunities, have established some principles for ourselves. So we will be looking at opportunities that are done in partnership with a local partner, that are a careful investment. We're not a high-risk investment player by any means. And opportunities that are in line with our principles of sustainable development and that are somehow linked to an energy transition going from fossil fuels to more renewable clean power on a system. So some of you may have seen in the media in recent weeks that we have signed an agreement with RTE, the French transmission operator, that we'll be looking jointly with them at various opportunities in the acquisition field. And we've been quite active in this in the department that I work in the past months. And we will probably be seeing our first announcement for an acquisition, I would say, in the coming months. I wouldn't pinpoint it any closer than that. One of the other things that we're looking to capitalize on, Hydro-Québec has a research institute that has been working since the 1970s, whose main focus was to develop innovations that we needed to make sure that our grid and our generation assets were working optimally. Many of those applications can be commercialized outside of Quebec. So although we develop them for our own purposes, our own needs, what we see is that many can be sold out of the province. So a few examples here. TM4 is a company that does electric motors that is very active right now in China, so selling a lot of motors for buses. Estalion is a joint venture with Sony that is for a 1.2 megawatt storage battery that's of utility grade that can be hooked up to a grid for a number of different purposes. We're just going through the final stages of testing on that one, but very promising lithium iron phosphate technology that has a huge advantage over some of the other products out there in terms of the number of times that it can be recharged. So somewhere between 4 and 5 times more recharging capacity than its competitors. Mir Innovation is a series of robotics applications that includes things like our Line Scout that does maintenance and inspection on high voltage lines, and a few other robots that we have that look at things like dam construction and inspection as well. So how is this going to impact us, these new growth avenues? Well, what we're looking at is by 2030, increasing from about $3 billion to $5.2 billion. So a much higher average growth than what we saw when we were looking just on the domestic side. And we think that there's about a quarter more of that growth that will be coming from increases in sales in our electricity markets. So we currently sell about 30 terawatt-hours outside of Quebec, primarily to New England and New York, a little bit less to Ontario. So we will be looking to increase that amount over the next few years. But the lion's share, the biggest portion of our growth, we expect to come from the acquisition sector. So that's that $900 million that you see in the darker gray on the right. And that pretty much brings me to the end of the discussion on our strategic plan.